Let us now look more closely at structure. The content of the structure section is the following. We first explore why structure is important in business and what some of the problems are with activity and entity system structure. Then we discuss key concepts and systemic guiding principles of structure in general and specifically of activity system structure. Then we look at redesigning and managing activity system structure. After this, we look at entity systems, namely the key concepts and systemic guiding principles of an entity system structure and how to redesign and manage an entity system structure, namely matrix design and through matrix management. Why is structure important in business? Well, the structure of a business process, for example, or of a functional system determines the efficiency of the process. It also determines the coordination between different processes. So the more coordination we have, obviously, the better our performance will be, and also the faster processes flow and the more accurate they are, the better will be our performance. The structure of the organization as a whole, which is depicted normally by the organogram, determines the coordination throughout the organization. If we have a silo organization, if we have different parts of the organization that are not coordinated, we have a bad organizational structure and we need to restructure. Some of the typical problems of an activity system that arise from a structure are the following. Too slow processing, because, for example, the structures are too far apart, and that could lead to delays or shortages of output. There could be wrong processing, like mistakes, faults, waste, duplications, poor quality of output. Or there could be discontinuity in processing, leading to no correct output, or to an overproduction, or to blockages. Structure-related problems in entity systems typically have to do with organizational structure, most importantly, lack of coordination between functional and business units. This is very typical in the traditional silo-type organizational structures which do not interface. There can also be internal competition, which is typically due to structure, and then duplications of services and products, or discontinuities of services that they are not taken up because of lack of coordination. And there can be accidents arising due to structural problems if the interfacing between units or functions is inappropriate and does not cover a situation completely, or if responsibilities are not distributed appropriately, accidents can arise. This section deals with the key concepts and systemic guiding principles of structure in general. Now, what is the definition of structure? Structure is the stable configuration of MEI or substance. In other words, it is how the substance is configured, what form it has got. That is what the structure is. Now, structure can be a material form, like a thing, an artifact, or a physical entity. It can also be an information configuration. We could call that an information thing, like an idea or a plan, an action pattern, an organizational structure, or a frequency pattern. So if we stay with the example of the organizational structure, what we do when we restructure an organization, we do not necessarily change the substance of the organization. What we are changing is the pattern of the way they interact. We change the form of the organization, but not what the organization does or who is employed or the machines or whatever. It is a reorganization, a reconfiguration of substance. That is what we imply by structure. The graphic representation of structure, we are representing structure through MEI dots that are configured in a triangular way, like this. Again, the orange lines indicate that these dots are connected, that they are a stable configuration. What is the difference between structure and process? Both structure and process consist of MEI, of substance, of meta-energy information. We have defined a structure as a stable MEI configuration and process as a flow of substance or MEI. Is mountain a structure or is mountain a process? But if we go back to our definition of a stable configuration, the tourist coming to the mountain sees the mountain as a stable configuration and would judge it as a structure. By comparison, the geologist who studies mountain and compares mountain over a longer period of time and what changes sees mountain as process. So what is the difference between structure and process? Well, the difference is really the period of observation within which meta-energy information either changes or doesn't change. If MEI changes in the period of observation, then it is a process. If it doesn't change, it is a structure. Ultimately, every material thing, at least in the universe, is a process if we look at it over long enough periods of time. Stars are being born, develop, die. The chair I'm sitting on is a structure as far as I'm concerned at the moment, but if we look at it over a long period of time, 10, 20 years time, it will not be the same. It has changed. It has been a process in the period of time of observation. Okay, let us look at some guiding principles of structure. Structure determines the form of the system or the artifact or the pattern. The same substance, if we are configuring it differently, can give rise to a different form. For example, if we take two glasses, the substance is the same, it is glass, but it is differently configured. The structure of that glass and that glass is different. It has a different form. Likewise, if we go and look at an organizational structure, we can have the same substance, the same activities take place, the same persons, the same resources are employed, but they are suddenly configured differently in time and space. So the structure has changed, the configuration has changed, not necessarily the substance. The MEI is the same, but the configuration of MEI has changed. Another principle is structure channels process flow. If you're looking at the analogy of the river, for example, the river, the water in the river flows according to the riverbed. So the riverbed is the structure of the river. The river cannot flow in a different direction. So the process flows according to the structure, and the structure of the riverbed gives the river the shape. Structure promotes stability and order. Because structure is a stable configuration, and because that stable configuration channels the process flow, it promotes stability. The river always seemingly looks the same, although the water is continuously changing. The river as a body of water looks the same because the structure makes sure that it can only flow in that particular way. So by reverse side, structure tacitly prevents change. Because structure is stable, it resists change and it prevents different process flow. So it makes the system stay the way it is. If you have a particular organizational structure, the decision making, the communication, the information, etc. will flow according to that structure, and even if we want to achieve a different process flow, we will not. So if we talk about organizational learning and we are not providing structures where first of all learning can occur, and then secondly where we record the learning, we will not have organizational learning. So what we need is always a structure and we need a process. A structure without the process is an empty riverbed without a river, and a river without a structure is a pool, a stagnating pool that doesn't flow. So structure is really passive governance. Structure is passive governance of process because it doesn't allow the process to flow in a different way, and because of that, structure is implicit governance. It is not direct governance. Now, as a management consultant, when one comes into an organization and one hears that they have tried to change a system, and they have done all the training and they have done the mindset change, and change doesn't happen, one would look at two things. First of all, is there a structure that prevents the system from changing, or is there wrong governance? Each of the two are possibilities that prevent the new structure from happening. Another guiding principle is that structure and process co-produce each other. For example, a particular MEI flow requires a particular structure to processes. Like, for example, the consistency of a particular paint requires particular tools that are able or appropriate to that particular consistency. And it needs to be applied in a particular manner. So the MEI, the process MEI of the paint needs a particular acting and support MEI, and vice versa. If we have already in a production line installed particular tools and particular procedures, we need a particular quality of processing MEI so that we can achieve the appropriate flow. Another systemic guiding principle of structure is that structure is actually pattern. It refers to the configuration of the acting, support and processing MEI in time and space. To give an example, if I take a lump of sugar and throw it into my coffee, it creates a wave-like pattern. If I'm taking a piece of lead and throw it into oil, it also creates that pattern. So structure is that pattern. It is not the substance of the oil and the lead and the sugar and the coffee. So structure is pattern. Within an activity system, structure refers to the pattern according to which the acting and support substance is configured or arranged. Within an entity system, the pattern refers to how the activity systems or functions of the organizations are interfacing with each other, irrespective of the content of MEI that flows in the activity system. So the generic pattern that biometric system theory advocates for organizations is the three-dimensional matrix. Structure can also be multifunctional. That means that one structure can serve different processes. For example, a building can house different activities. We can have a restaurant, we can have a dancing floor, we can have a conference center. So the same structure serves different processes. This section deals with key concepts and systemic guiding principles associated with an activity system structure. The structure of an activity system is the configuration of the acting and the support substance in time and space. Now let us unpack that a little bit. What is an acting substance? The acting substance are the resources that do the processing. For example, in my cake baking activity system, I, the cook, am the acting substance. I'm doing the mixing and all that. The support MEI or support substance would be the tools and the infrastructure, for example, like the kitchen counter, the bowls, the mixers, the room in which it takes place, etc. In an organizational context, we refer to the acting and support substance as the resources. Human resources, knowledge resources, material resources, technological resources, financial resources, etc. If you look at the graphic depiction of the structure of an activity system, we have here the activity system represented by the gray area and the process flow with the various phases of MEI represented by the dots. These processes flow through different structures or MEI configurations. We could call them the workstations. So my ingredients flow through the one workstation where the dough gets mixed and another workstation where the dough gets baked and so on. So what we do in a business process redesign, we are changing the configuration of the acting and support substances and the relationship between them in time and space. For example, if I have a cake baking situation where I have to go one floor down to get my mixing bowl and I have to go to the shop to get some ingredients and the oven is in the one corner and the fridge is in the other corner and the different ingredients are somewhere else, it takes me a long time to assemble everything and to mix the cake and to produce it. So what I would need to do is I would need to redesign the kitchen to make it efficient so that with one hand I can get the ingredients from here and the support substance from there, and I move the MEI to the next workstation in a very short distance and in a short period of time. And this is basically what we do in business process redesign. We can also have multifunctional structure. What that means is that two activity systems or more activity systems share the same structure. So if you're looking at the graphic depiction of that, we have two activity systems. For example, two business processes in a financial environment, and they share one structure as, for example, a call center. Or we could have two activity systems, two production lines in a car manufacturer, and they're sharing one structure, which is the paint shop. Each activity system, of course, has its own structures as well. So they're independent until they are combined for a short period of time in a shared structure. To achieve a good coordinated structure, one needs to have careful business process redesign of both of those activity systems. This section is concerned with managing and designing or redesigning the structure of an activity system. To design or redesign the structure of an activity system that is of a project or a function or a business process involves the following. For each processing phase, we need to determine what acting resources and what support resources are required. Then we need to consider the arrangement of these acting and support resources in time and space. We need to arrange them in such a way that the processing that is facilitated by the structure is efficient. We also need to consider tapping between the various phases of the project and ensure that we have got acting and support resources available that can do the tapping. We need to ensure that we have sufficient quality as well as quantity of all acting and support resources available, and if we don't have it, we should consider building capacities through informationizing. That could involve automation, for example, or adding information into the system, or educating the acting resources, or developing them in any other way. We should also build ongoing learning and improvement into the structure design so that in future the structure can learn and improve by itself. We could also consider multifunctional use of the acting and support resources. That means that we can use the same acting and support resources for other types of processing as well. This would mean that we can do more with less. Now let us look at the structure of an entity system. The structure of an entity system is comprised of the pattern of interaction of its activity systems. So, for example, in a business organization, the structure is represented by the organogram, and it really depicts how the different activities of the organizational entity are configured. We have learned that the knot-like entity systems of the biomatrix have a generic threefold organization that applies for all entity systems. They consist of outward-directed activity systems, inward-directed activity systems, and self-directed activity systems. Now, if we apply that in an organizational context, how they are interacting with each other, we are getting a three-dimensional matrix. The outward, the inward, and the self-directed activity systems are interfacing with each other in a matrix fashion. That is also true in other systems, natural systems, where, for example, in the body, the circulatory system interfaces with all the other systems in a matrix fashion. If we apply that to an organization, a business organization, then we would get this three-dimensional matrix like this. We have the outward-directed business activity systems. Those are production and service delivery lines. Different production lines, for example, the first line may be car model number 1, car model number 2, car model number 3, or service number 1, service number 2, etc. Inward directed towards the specific functions that are part of each system, the processing functions. They are interfacing in a vertical manner. Typically in a business environment, we are speaking of the marketing function, the business development function, the operations functions, the dispatching functions, etc. And then there are the self-directed organizational support functions. Those are functions like my administrative, my corporate finance, my HR functions, my IT functions, etc. They interface with both the business support lines and the functions specific, the line functions that are needed on the production line. And a second part of the self-directed activity systems are the governance systems, the business support systems tend to go downwards into the organization, while the upward directed systems are the governance systems. An entity system is a web within a web. Within the three-dimensional matrix, each activity system, each function is part of its unique industry supply chain. Obviously, each production line is part of a supply chain that deals with those types of products, but also the support functions like HR function or IT function have their own function-specific industry. They are part of the HR or IT industry. Because each line is connected to an environment through its own supply chain, the matrix is actually a web of interacting supply chains. That interaction of these different supply chains becomes unique in that particular matrix, giving rise to an emergence that is different to that of the competitors of the organization. And ultimately, the matrix is a web within the web of the economy, society, and the biomatrix at large. We come now to the section of matrix design. How do we start to design an organizational matrix? The basis of the matrix is the outward directed activity system, because every organization exists in order to provide a good or service to the external environment, and this is what the business activity system or business activity systems are there for. So we first have a look at how is the business activity system configured, what are its particular phases. These could be parallel phases, they could be sequential phases. For example, if we have a cake baking activity system, this could consist of sub-activity systems dealing with different types of cakes, chocolate, carrot, other cakes. We can bake them at the same time, so there would be parallel processed in my kitchen. We have also learned that activity systems can have sequential sub-activity systems. They typically are concerned with how the product is being produced or processed. In the cake example, we mentioned the phases of buying ingredients, mixing ingredients, baking the cake. These occur in sequence. If we are putting the parallel and the sequential activity systems together, we get a matrix structure. So, as we produce our different types of cakes, they go through the same phases, procuring, mixing, baking, and I can organize those phases in themselves. They become the function that interface with the production of the goods or services. For example, I can procure the ingredients for all types of cake that I'm going to make at the same time. I may even be able to mix some of the dough at the same time before splitting it, and some dough goes into that cake and another into another. And if I have a big enough oven, I can bake all 3 cakes at the same time. Let us now discuss each of the 3 types of activity systems in more detail. First, the business activity systems. The first question one asks when redesigning an organization is, what is the business of the organization? What are the products and services that are being produced, and how can we bundle them together appropriately? For example, if I have a bakery, I will be baking bread, cakes, biscuits. So I'm grouping my business activity systems according to the related outputs they are producing. Likewise, a car manufacturer will have car type 1, type 2, type 3, different kinds of models. Or a construction company will group together its road building activities, dam building activities, and bridge building activities, for example. These business activity systems are referred to as business processes or production lines or business units or business lines in different contexts. We call them business activity systems. Typically, within one business activity system or one business unit, there will be sub-products being produced. So in our bakery, we don't just make one bread, we make 10 or 20 different types of breads. So they are organized in sub-activity systems. In the example of the retail business, we may have 3 different types of shops: the very large hypermarkets, the large supermarkets, and the small neighborhood convenience stores. These will be organized together. They're the 3 types of services in that retail business. So each activity system can consist of sub-activity systems. Typically they relate to different projects or different products that are being bundled together. After we have determined the groups of products and services and how they would nicely group together, we are looking at the phases of production or the phases of the service delivery of each of those lines, and we will see how they connect. So as I analyze how I'm baking a cake, I will need to procure ingredients, mix, bake, package, sell. The same sequence will be needed for the bread and for the biscuits. Some of the products will require a function along the way which others do not require. For example, in the case of cakes, after the baking I will need to decorate the cake. This is a phase which the bread doesn't share. Maybe the biscuits would have some decoration as well. So here we have a business support function that is not interfacing with all the business activity systems. Now, the purpose of the business support activity system is to provide resources to the different business activity systems. In the case of procurement, they provide the processing MEI, in other words, the ingredients that are being baked into cakes, bread, or biscuits. In the mixing phase, there will be the mixer provided, the person or the machine that does the mixing. In the baking phase, we will provide the ovens, the person who is putting things into the oven and out of the oven, or the automate who does that, and so on. In a business context, the business support activity systems are typically referred to as line functions. If we look at what would be some of the generic business support activity systems that apply to most organizations, then one could group them into 2 broad groups. The one have to do with marketing and selling, and the others have to do with production. In the case of a service organization, the production is often referred to as operations. In a manufacturing environment, one talks more about production. The third type of functions or activity systems that we need to explore is that of the so-called organization support activity systems. In many companies, they are referred to as central services. Their generic purpose is to provide the infrastructure and the administrative support to the business support and business activity systems. To illustrate the relevance of those functions, we can use our cake example again. The difference between baking a cake on a Sunday afternoon, and having a cake business lies to a large extent in the organization support functions. The cake that I bake on a Sunday afternoon, in terms of sequencing of the baking, in terms of the ingredients that are being used, is exactly the same that I may sell in my cake shop. So the difference does not lie in the cake. Of course, I'm baking more than one a week, so it is a matter of upscaling the quantity. But what is additionally required as I start my cake factory is I will need, besides the production functions, some kind of marketing and selling function. So I need to extend my business support systems, and I need to add various organization support functions. I will need to watch my cash flow, do budgets, file tax returns, employ people, have stock control with a good IT system. We'll probably need legal advice about the health department requirements. I will need to do a lot of administration and so on. So all those functions serve the purpose of having an organization, not baking a cake. So it is in order to enable all the other functions to do what they do. So this is why we call them organization support function. We have said that activity systems have sub-activity systems. That is true for all activity systems or functions in an organization. The products have sub-products. The business support activity systems will have sub-functions. So, for example, marketing may have sub-functions like customer surveys and branding rules and market research and selling function. Likewise, the organization support functions will have sub-functions. If I'm taking human resource management, for example, it typically contains functions concerned with employment, with legal contracts, mediating in conflict, training, career development, performance evaluation, and similar sub-functions. I have mentioned previously that it is not always straightforward to bundle different products and services that an organization delivers into appropriate business activity systems. The difficulties typically come when an organization sells different products and services to the same customer, and also if they have both standardized and customized products and services that they try to sell to the same customer. Often the first debate that has to occur is, what is the kind of business the organization wants? Do we want to sell standardized, run-of-the-mill products? Do we want to customize? Do we want to combine the two in a unique way that defines our business? A typical case study where those questions arise are in the insurance industry. It can be observed that many insurance companies organize themselves according to the type of products they sell. Short-term life, that is household, motor insurance, versus various life products. And they try to sell those products to the same brokers for reselling or banks for reselling, or even direct to individuals. One of the disadvantages is, if the organization is based on products, that each of those business units specializing in a product sells to the same client like another business unit sells to. That can lead to internal competition. It can even create branding problems when the appearance of these different business units is different. There can be different entry points into the client, so that the client organization, say the broker or bank, is actually not aware that it deals with different business units within the insurance company. And there could also be a lack of product service coordination or a customization for different customers, because the organization operates according to a product silo. The advantage of that is that the product service efficiencies are greater if there's one dedicated business unit that deals with this product only. Another way of organizing the business would be market-based, that the business units are directed at the specific market. So there would be a broker unit, a selling direct business unit, a business unit catering for banks, etc. And each of those business units sells all products, or as many products as appropriate to that particular customer. The advantage of this is that there can be better customization and better client service, because the products can be adjusted to the needs of those specific market niches. A disadvantage could be that there's a duplication in operations or in the production of the products. And I have seen that, for example, there were different call centers or different organizational structures within such business units. There is, however, not that disadvantage if the different products and services are delivered via the business support services. So we would have, for example, a household unit, motor unit, life unit, interfacing with each of the three different business units, and together they can customize the otherwise standardized product for their specific organization. The matrix clarifies the incorporating of new structures or new other businesses and makes that easier. Any organization that wants to continue to grow and develop must do new product, service, and business development. The new product and service developments would be an added business activity system, headed by a new product service champion who interfaces with all business activity system to co-develop the new product or service. New business development would be handled as a business support activity system, interfacing with all existing product service lines. And the champion of new business development will interact with those business lines in assisting them to innovate, develop new product services within their existing product services, or customize existing product services in order to sell to new markets. Sometimes the new business development is part of the marketing function. It depends how complex new business development is, if it is a separate entity or if it is part of marketing. It could also lead to new product service packages from the different product service lines and could then result in the development of a new product service activity system. Then it would be one of the new business activity systems of the organization. Acquisitions of other organizations can occur around one or all of those three types of activity systems. For example, an organization can buy up another organization that produces goods and services which are complementary to those it has itself, and add that new business as a new business activity system. Or an organization can extend its existing business upstream and downstream. For example, it could buy up a supplier who has delivered components and from now on produce those components internally. This would be upstream extension of the business. Or the organization could buy a sales network to distribute its existing products and services better, that would be a downstream extension. There could also be an extension of the resources of the organization. It could buy up another company, stop the production and service delivery of that other company, and only incorporate the staff and maybe some material assets into its organization. If an organization merges with another organization, it has to do so along the three types of activity systems. The business support systems will have to be merged. The organization support systems, like the different finance systems, the different HR, IT systems will have to be merged. And the business activity systems could be merged or could be added if the business was a different one. Obviously, one of the critical issues in such acquisition and mergers is always the organizational culture issue, to integrate diverse organizational cultures, and this is something we are going to deal with in the ethos section. We are looking now at international expansion and how the 3D matrix could handle this. Probably before we expand, we will have an exploration phase and we will have a temporary structure within our existing organization that looks at business development in other countries. During such an exploration phase, the structure could be a business support structure which crosses all our product service lines. We would set up such a structure if the main focus is on how do we get existing products and services implemented in another country, who would be possible suitable business partners, or how would we have to customize our products and services. So we would have that structure before we think of actually establishing another organization. We could also have international business development structure that is concerned with international product service delivery. We would have that if we want to have an existing product or service produced or delivered in another country, and if we want another organization that we may have acquired or partnered with deliver and produce. That means that we would have to explore how far their functional capability is suitable to do that. So if we are having a business activity line as such a temporary structure, then we will explore the cross-functional capabilities of that particular subsidiary in producing our or reproducing our products, services. If we want to set up an actual organization and we want to explore how we can set up an organization and all aspects of production and running the business, then we would probably have a temporary structure created on the diagonal as an organization support structure, because they can bring in the necessary business activity players, function-specific players, and also other organization support line players into the negotiations or the exploration as is required. Once we actually have an international expansion or an international business, and we want to show the different sub-businesses or sub-parts of our business or the different subsidiaries within an overarching matrix, then we have different options. If the business is an online one, we probably will have one matrix, and any customization, regional development and sales would be handled as sub-activity systems from the center. Those are the sublines within each of the broad activity system areas. An example of that could be if we have sales depot, or if we have minor production units that are managed by somebody else, almost in a partnership, almost an outsourcing situation, except that we would be the owners of it. If we want to establish activity systems in their own right, we have the following options. For example, if we want to have certain components produced in a different country, then from our international organizational matrix perspective, those would be business support activity systems. From the perspective in that country, they would be their own business activity systems. That is illustrated by the small arrows that go across the business activity system. They will also need in that country organization support, local HR, financial facility administration, and so on. So they will also have local organization support lines. Therefore, practical purposes, a sub-matrix within our matrix. Why is it useful to show such business units as part of the overarching matrix? Well, the reason is that they show very clearly where the interfacing occurs and where coordination must be created. Another possibility is that we are reproducing our manufacturing in another country, or our goods and service delivery in another country, using local business support. This is illustrated by the small business support arrows crossing the business activity system. The same is true in that case. The business unit will have to have local local organization support structures like local IT system, HR, finance, facility administration, and so on. Again, the lines show clearly where coordination within the larger whole needs to occur. The importance of showing a subsidiary business within the overarching organizational structure is that it very clearly illustrates how governance and coordination can flow within the overarching matrix. So in the case where we reproduce the production of goods and services in another country, we have coordination between the two activity systems. Then we also can have coordination between the functions, in other words, the business support activity systems in the other country and in our country, and learning can happen between them. Governance can flow, experience can be exchanged, so organizational learning is enhanced. They can also share the same knowledge repositories, and if there's innovation in one part of the world, it can thereby be communicated into or to other parts of the world, both from a cross-functional perspective as well as from a function-specific perspective. And the central services also are coordinated, so that governance from the center can flow into the business units and vice versa, and all their functions. If we have a situation where components are being produced for all our production lines, then there is a coordination between the different activity systems and the business support systems that supply a particular component. There is also a coordination of that component from a function-specific perspective to the center, and of course there is coordination between the central services. We're going to explore now in a little more detail how to manage a three-dimensional matrix. First, what are the advantages and potential disadvantages of a 3D matrix vis-a-vis other organizational structures? Then, what is the inherent organization of a 3D matrix, the generic organization? How can we manage conflict within a matrix? Then we explore stability and change and the shift of ethos that is required in order to do matrix management. What are the advantages of a three-dimensional matrix vis-a-vis a traditional organization? That could be the traditional hierarchy or various hybrids of organizations that are now being explored, even with partial matrix involvement. But typically those are two-dimensional matrices. The advantage of the traditional hierarchy was that it produced economies of scale. It was function specific and it produced within those functions economies of scale as well as functional excellence. This is also true for the three-dimensional matrix. It produces economies of scale because it runs across the different business lines, and it also produces functional excellence because it is also functionally organized as well as organized in a cross-functional business manner. It produces even more functional excellence than the traditional structure because it also learns from application of the function in different business environments and brings that knowledge back into the function. The main disadvantages of the traditional structures are that they operate in silos, they contain silos, and there could be blockages in the flow of products and services, the so-called throughput flow, and also functional separation, which can lead to duplication and discontinuities. By comparison, the 3D matrix is cross-functional, so it coordinates across functions, ensures optimal flow of throughput through the various functions, and functional coordination. As a result, it produces cross-functional synergies, which the hierarchy did not. Also, in the traditional hierarchy, there used to be lots of structural conflicts because of the isolation of the different structures from each other. These could include as much as internal competition, duplications, inflexibilities, conflict. By comparison, the three-dimensional matrix encourages multifunctional orientation as well as cross-functional cooperation. So it is a process worldview compared to a structure worldview, and process crosses different structures if they are allowed to do so. Other disadvantages of the traditional structure was that they were very inward focused. Sometimes they were so inward focused that the customer or external stakeholder was almost afterthought. By comparison, the 3D matrix encourages both an inward and an outward focus. The traditional structures had lots of discontinuities. By comparison, the 3D matrix thinks continuity, thinks process, operates as supply chains. In fact, each function or activity system within the 3D matrix is managed as a supply chain. The traditional structure was mostly run in a top-down manner. Managers used to do the decision making, and then the lower levels had to implement those decisions. By comparison, the 3D matrix encourages self-governance, and that self-governance is coordinated through the various planning forums and planning structures that are set up along the lines of the 3D matrix. which again allows the functional and cross-functional flow of governing information in a very orderly manner. The same is true for information flow. It goes across functions, along functions, across levels. By comparison, the traditional organization structure had problems in communication flow because there were no interconnections between the silos. Another big problem in the traditional structure is that it is slow to react to the environment. They were clumsy. Some years ago, a book appeared that was called "The Giants Have to Learn to Dance," meaning these huge giant organizations that need to learn to dance. By comparison, the 3D matrix allows very rapid reaction to the environment because each activity system, each function, business unit within the matrix is in touch with the environment and brings the learning from the environment in the organization, in either the function-specific environment, or if the information occurs along the business activity system, then in a cross-functional way, and it is distributed through the matrix from the cross-functional activity systems into the specific function, or the knowledge is brought in through a function and distributed cross-functionally along the various business lines. So there can be very quick reaction to all sorts of changes in the environment that a traditional hierarchy would not even notice. There are, however, potential disadvantages in having a three-dimensional matrix. There's first of all the perceived complexity. Some persons feel that it is very difficult to operate in a multifunctional environment, and that it was so much easier to operate in a traditional hierarchy where one knew exactly one's place and how to climb the ladder. Well, there is a systems saying by Ashley. It is called the law of requisite variety, and it said a structure has to be, or a system has to be, as complex as its environment is. So as we moved from the industrial age with a relatively stable environment into an information age with a very fast and rapidly changing environment, the structures have to match the complexity of the environment. And what is required to manage that, and that is another potential disadvantage, organizational culture and also the mindsets of individual members of the organization will have to change. Otherwise, matrix management is not possible. The structure has an inherent organization, and it forces the functioning of the activity systems in a particular way, simply because this is how the structure is organized. The business activity systems, or business lines, are set up in a cross-functional way. We have learned that the different phases that occur in the production of a good or service give rise to our so-called business support activity systems, and that our business activity system therefore flows through these various business support systems. They co-produce the production of goods and services. And it is very important to have a head or a champion for a particular product and service who is concerned with ensuring that that cross-functional flow is smooth. So the business activity system is thinking cross-functionally, and it is focused on a particular product or service that it is responsible for producing. We need to have planning forums structured around business activity systems, and these in their nature are also cross-functional. So there's cross-functional operational and strategic planning happening around the focus of that specific product. So business activity systems encourage cross-functional product and service development and learning. The generic functions of a business support activity system, that's that function specific, or the line function as we sometimes call it in a business, that function specific activity system like marketing or engineering or welding, that runs across the different business activity systems, has a function focus. It enables the members of the system to have enough knowledge and equipment to perform their specific function on one or more of the business lines. This business support activity system governs from a function-specific perspective. It brings industry governance around marketing or around engineering or welding into the business activities. They also evaluate what professional behavior is in that particular function. They know about benchmarking, auditing, and so on with respect to that function. They're responsible for functional problem solving and also for functional environmental scanning. So what is new in marketing, or what is new in engineering, what is new in welding? And learning and development is function specific. What's new out there, what can we learn from our industry? At the same time, the function is running across the business activity systems, so it is set up in a cross-business manner, and thereby it helps to coordinate the different business activity systems. So, for example, marketing can help coordinate the different marketing initiatives of the different business lines. And they can create economies of scale by combining the different budgets, the different ideas around marketing, and promoting a marketing plan or service that is win-win for all different business lines. And learning and development is also business specific. Each marketer will share their experiences from a market perspective that they had in a particular business line with the colleagues who operate in other business lines. So there is learning created across the businesses. And if there's innovation in one business line, it is immediately communicated to the peers in the same function, so they can apply that in their specific business environment on which they serve as well. The organization support activity systems are also set up in a function-specific way. They provide functional support to both the business and the business support activity systems. So they coordinate all activity systems, for example, finance or IT or HR, would interface with all other activity systems and enable those activity systems from that specific functional perspective. They also provide governance, financial or IT governance. They do function-specific problem solving, function-specific environmental scanning, what's new in finance or IT, and function-specific learning, what's new in our industry. And they coordinate organization-wide through all activity systems, and as such, they hold the organization as a whole together, because all activity systems have to comply to the same standards and governance set by each of those organization support activity systems. Learning and development also occurs from a business and multiple functional context. So HR managers who are cooperating with different functional units or business units can bring that knowledge back into, for example, the shared HR meeting, and every HR practitioner can learn from application of their colleagues in different parts of the organization. So there is huge organizational learning taking place, provided it is recorded appropriately. Then those support services also assist in generating economies of scale, just like the business support services. And this is one of the reasons why nowadays many organizations create a central service unit. And through their governance, they disseminate standardization throughout the organization and also hold the whole organization together as one whole. Unlike the traditional hierarchy, where every function was its own empire and was organized in isolation of all the others and therefore had very little open conflict with other functions, in the matrix there's the potential of lots of conflict because of the interaction of different activity systems and the fact that every member of the organization is part of different activity systems. So there can be a lot of conflict occurring, and it is important that that conflict is being managed properly. To not have a matrix in order to avoid conflict is not the answer, because as soon as there is interaction between systems, there is conflict. This is unavoidable. So if we want interaction and a business to thrive needs a lot of interaction with different parts in the economy and within itself, need to learn to manage conflict. There are some generic management rules associated with matrix, and we can explore those in the context of the most typical conflicts that occur in the matrix. One very typical conflict is between a business and a business support activity system. For example, the marketing manager wants to send, the head of marketing wants to send one of the marketing managers on a conference on marketing. The business manager has a product launch at the same time and requires the presence of the marketing manager. How is that conflict resolved? There's a generic rule in management that business, short-term business interests tend to overrule short-term function-specific interests. So the marketing manager has to attend the product launch if a replacement is not acceptable, and a replacement has to go to the conference. However, if the third year running, the business manager has the launch at the time when there's a conference, then there may be some deeper conflict here, and the conflict is one between long-term functional business development and short-term business interest. And it may be a conflict that has to be addressed more fundamentally at the level between the business managers of the two activity systems, or if they can't see eye to eye, then maybe it can be deferred to the board. Another conflict between business and business support activity systems have to do with governance. Sometimes business managers want to take shortcuts in the name of meeting budgets, deadlines, and so on, and would love to bypass certain functional governance. However, if there is functional governance requiring compliance to a particular procedure, even if it is costly, even if it is delaying, it has to be adhered to. So in that case, functional governance overrules business interests. The business manager has to comply. Another typical conflict is between business and organization support activity systems. Organization support activity systems like corporate finance, IT, HR is standardized by nature. The same rules apply to all parts of the organization. It very often happens that one business unit says that particular software package or that particular HR rule doesn't suit our specific business. This may or may not be the case. If it is really a serious mismatch, then there will have to be co-design between the central service and the business. If that can't be arranged, then there is a conflict that needs to be looked into, and that is probably deferred to the board. Less serious but very widespread are the kind of conflicts where there's lack of discipline and compliance in general. People just don't like the discipline of compliance, so they don't adhere to the IT rules and put in their worksheets or their leave forms or whatever it is. Those kind of conflicts have to be reinforced through sanctions. Those kind of regulations have to be entrenched in the performance management criteria or in the performance evaluation criteria of individuals in the context of maybe the so-called 360 evaluation. So continuous non-compliance would have to be sanctions or compliance rewarded. And that is not necessarily financial rewards. A similar issue would be if we want to have learning to take place and sharing of knowledge, then this would have to be linked into evaluation and reward systems. Otherwise, it does not happen. A typical conflict that occurs between different business activity systems is that around resource allocation. Very often in project-based organizations where key staff has to be shared between different projects, there is huge conflict of who gets the expert at what time. There has to be negotiations, co-development from a synergistic and systemic perspective. This is why it is important that system thinking is known amongst managers in environments like that. If they cannot come to a solution, if a situation cannot be co-developed in a win-win manner, again, the conflict will have to be deferred. And then the organizational perspective kicks in. What is more important from the perspective of an organization to have activity system A or activity system B delaying its production? So we are not looking at it then from the perspective of two activity systems that want to be optimizing their own functioning, but we are looking at resource allocation from an optimizing perspective from the organization as a whole. One very important issue is that of stability versus change. The faster the environment changes, the faster the system must change. And what we have experienced in the last 20 or 30 years is an increasing pace of change. And organizations are struggling in the light of globalization and the information explosion to keep up with the growing demands and to adjust themselves to it. If there are repeated changes in structure, the problems that organizations experience are compounded. They are dealing now with internal structural problems as well as the challenge of adapting to a continuously changing environment. One can illustrate these shifts that organizations experienced in the last few decades by comparing mountain climbing and surfing. Very often in the industrial age, organization structure development was likened to mountain climbing. You plot the path and you stake your flag where you want to be, and then you start implementing and plotting your way towards the peak. And when reached, then the next peak will be mapped out and one starts climbing. Occasionally it was a little slower, occasionally a little faster. This is not possible anymore. There is no time for that sort of reflection and step-by-step approach. The planning and implementation have to occur in a continuous sequence. That is where our performance management cycle comes in, that we are going to discuss a bit later. The planning and implementation and the adjustment of the one to the other has to occur regularly. And this can be likened to the surfer. Businesses nowadays have to surf. As wave after wave comes in, they have to ride each wave as best they can, avoiding the rocks of the threads as best as they can, and plodding away almost as an emergence between the threats and the opportunities. And how do we measure success? Well, as long as they are surfing, they are successful. When they're falling off the board and being taken over or bankrupt or bought up, then the surfing was not successful. So to surf successfully, one needs a surfboard. Body surfing alone cannot handle big waves. So what is the surfboard? The surfboard is the three-dimensional matrix. It is a structure that facilitates rapid change. It provides the stability that an organization needs in order to change and adapt to its environment. By comparison, other structures do not allow the same kind of flexibilities. So the structure of the traditional hierarchy, the function-specific, clumsy, slow, separate structures are not suitable at all in the information age. The three-dimensional matrix allows rapid change because of its functional and cross-functional flow and the overlapping structures of planning forums that range from top management to the coal face in both functional and cross-functional ways. So they allow rapid flow of change to go through the organization, and yet they allow that in an orderly manner. Even structural changes within the matrix can be handled in an orderly manner, as we have seen in the acquisition, merger, international expansion sections. We can add business activity systems, business support systems, or take them away, or export them to other countries and still keep coordination within an overarching matrix. So it is an orderly environment within which a lot of seeming turbulent change can flow. However, I want to emphasize again, this requires a shift in ethos, both organizational ethos as well as the ethos or worldview of individuals. The shift in worldview that is required to facilitate successfully matrix management is one from a structure perspective to a process-based worldview. The idea of I have my position, this is my work, I don't need to be concerned about anything else as long as my boss is happy with me and I can climb that particular ladder, is not possible within the matrix. We have to have a process orientation. That means process is flow, continuity. Who is using the output of my work? How is it being tapped? There is a co-responsibility in tapping. If my work flow is not acceptable to whoever is using it, we have to co-produce changes in my system or changes in the system that follows. We have to work together, we have to synergize. I have to facilitate tapping. I have to think along supply chains. So it is not only the next step, but it is the step after and after. We have to think supply chain of a function going from the external environment through the organizational environment into the internal environment. So for example, every functional line is a supply chain. Not only the goods and services we produce managed along the supply chain, that we align with suppliers and that we align with our customers, but also the internal supply chains need to link up with their specific industry, bring the knowledge, bring the new in, and have the flow happening. The other shift we have to make is that to a web-based worldview. And that involves thinking of we are a web consisting of multiple functions. We have mentioned previously that every employee is likely to have several functions, some associated with business support systems, that's the specific career they are in, for example, welding. And then they have functions that they perform in the context of specific business activity systems. So the welder may work on different projects, doing different kinds of welding. And if he or she has a computer, there will also be requirements regarding the use of that internal IT system. They may have a budget and being accountable to the corporate finance manager and so on. We are all bundles of functions, and we are interweaving with or interlinking with different parts within the organization. Typically, when as a management consultant I interact with an organization and we have these workshops where people look at matrix management, we would get the question of some of the delegates who say, and where do I sit on that matrix? Who is my boss? They have to learn that there is no specific seat they belong to. They belong to many functions at different places, and they have different bosses in different contexts. And I have learned that a useful analogy that illustrates that is when one uses one's personal life. I'm a worker, I'm a parent, I'm a child, I'm a churchgoer, and I belong to various other functions. How do I know how to behave in these different environments? When am I the one or the other? So if one asks a delegate, well, are you a parent? Yes. Are you a parent now that you are sitting at work? Yes. Do you have any difficulties to distinguish when you must be a parent and what is involved in the parenting role and what is involved in the employee role? No, there's no difficulty. So why would there be more difficulty in an organizational context? And the difficulties only come because people have not thought through that. And it is very important that one facilitates workshops where people become aware of that. The other part of the web-based worldview is multiple connectivity. I am a web within a web of the organization, but some of my functions also reach outside the organization. And I become more and more valuable to the organization if I can bring resources from outside the organization into the organization in different functional contexts. Without this shift of ethos, matrix management is problematic. And additionally to a shift in ethos, we also need to have reinforcing governance. The governance must be aligned with the structure of the matrix. And this is what we are going to discuss in the next section. Governance of a matrix in such a way that we become a learning organization. So we are going to give the various governance principles associated with that. Let us now look at the application of structure in activity and entity systems. The processing within an activity system involves structure, both an acting and support structure. Also, each sub-activity system has its own structures. And the efficient and effective functioning of the activity system requires an optimal arrangement of the structure in time and space. Very often in the context of a business that involves a business process redesign, of which the rearrangement of the acting and support structure is an important part. Another important consideration of structure within activity systems is the multifunctionality of structures. This implies that one structure can serve more than one activity system. An example would be the different production lines in a car manufacturer share one structure, namely the paint shop. To ensure that the structure contributes to the optimal MEI flow within each of the different activity systems that it serves, one needs to iterate between the design of process and the design of structure. The structure in an entity system is concerned with the pattern of interaction of the activity systems of that entity. In the context of an organization, we typically call the structure the organogram. According to biometric system theory, the optimal organogram would be a three-dimensional matrix which channels the flow of meta-energy information throughout the organization in the most optimal manner. By comparison, the restructuring of an activity system is about efficient and effective workflow.